Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me a very longtime colleague and friend, Alan Lowe, who's currently Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of Product IP and Legal Operations at Meta, also formerly known as Facebook. Alan, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here, Richard. Great seeing you.
So Alan, I've known you for many years and you have been on my list. So I'm really thrilled that we finally are going to be able to have this conversation. I know you've done a ton of stuff and I want to talk about some of those, but let me start by asking you really kind of why you went to law school in the first place.
Sure. And great to be here. I've been a fan of your podcast, and Richard, I've been waiting for you to call. So I'm glad you finally did. Law school for me was probably non-obvious. I grew up in a household where, my father was an engineer. He's the oldest son of many brothers and sisters. Many of my uncles are engineers. And so I was brought up in a household where there was almost an expectation I was going to go into engineering.
Oh.
And so I was good in math. That was kind of the natural thing. My first year, I hated it. And so there were a lot of arguments with my dad about, whether I was going to stick with it or not. I rebelled by just not going to class and doing poorly and just having fun my first couple of years in engineering school. And then there came a time when I got such a bad grade, it was just above failing, that I was literally afraid of showing, my grades to my dad, and it just scared me straight. And I turned it around, and I went from, I don't know, I'm embarrassed to even say what my GPA was at that time in my first couple of years, but basically close to a 4.0 in my last couple of years. And so I was all set, to be an engineer. And my dad was a career 35 plus years at Bell Laboratories. And in my senior year, he says to me, you know what, Alan, I think actually it'd be better if you weren't an engineer. And I was just like, what are you talking about? We've argued about this. They said, well, he was a career engineer, and what he thought would be better for me was to either go to business school or to law school. So use engineering as a foundation, as a background, but then, get an advanced degree and either go MBA or go law school. And so he introduced me to a patent attorney that he worked with at Bell Laboratories, who I met with and gave me some advice and said he suggested I move to DC and go work at the patent office. And then second, go to law school at night because the patent office would pay for some of that. And then during law school, switch over to a law firm so that by the time I graduate, I've got minimum debt, I've got experience in government, I've got experience in a law firm, and then, I'm ready to hit the ground running after I graduate. And being someone at that time that I really didn't have much of a plan, I didn't really have many ideas about what I wanted to do, I just said, that sounds good to me. So I just followed that plan. And so moved to DC. And then over the next 4 to 5 years, I basically did exactly what the patent attorney suggested. And that's how I ended up into law school and then started my career in IP.
And what did you like that? I mean, what was your experience? I mean, having been a rebellious engineer, then you're studying law, you're working on patents at the patent office. Well, how did you like all that?
Yeah, it was okay. It was interesting. I really liked the people I was meeting. It was all foreign. Engineering school is very different from law school in terms of, either engineering, there's answers, law school, there's no answers. So getting used to that. What I realized pretty quickly once I was in a law firm was I made a mistake. I should have gone to business school. So that was my first realization. But I was lucky because I got to be close with the managing partner of the law firm I was working at. And we would spend late nights talking about management of the firm. And what I found was there was an opportunity for me to kind of learn the business side of a law firm. And so my aspiration then at that point, after a few years at the law firm, was either stay and become a managing partner. I really kind of enjoyed that part of it. Or leave and start my own law firm. And the thing that I really started to pick up on was that there was an entrepreneurial spirit in me. And that's why I probably should have gone to business school, is that I should have just been an entrepreneur.
Yeah, right.
Having now been in the legal profession, I could find ways to be able to scratch that itch. And so I was all ready to either start my own law firm or stay on and try to become managing partner. And then the law firm decided to open up a Palo Alto office.
Mm-hmm.
And so they asked if any of the lawyers wanted to move out to Palo Alto to help start this brand new office. And I thought, maybe this is the best of both worlds. I can be entrepreneurial, help start something new, get some clients, help build, attract the talent, but at the same time have the backing of a law firm, have a firm that has a reputation and has an existing client base.
Yep.
So I said, okay, I'll volunteer, sight unseen, move out to California. This is in '97. And, at that time I was debating, should I buy a house? Should I not buy a house? And I was like pretty convinced I was going to stay out here, and I've been here ever since. But back then I was looking at the property values and prices, and I said, okay, I'm no dummy. I'm not going to buy into this high market. I'm going to wait for it to come down. And almost 25, 30 years later, it's just gone up every year. So that was a huge mistake on the real estate side. But for 3 years, I helped build the office in Palo Alto. And that was, for me, a huge, tremendous experience, a lot of fun. To be honest, I was doing probably too much. I had a young child at that time. I was working weekends. I was working, late nights every night. And I was starting to experience some degree of burnout. So I did a quick stint clerking for a judge, a federal judge in San Jose. And it was kind of happenstance. I went to a conference that this judge was speaking at. He was kind of a well-known judge in the IP space. And at the very beginning of his presentation, he said, in case anyone knows anyone, I'm looking for a clerk for 6 months. My current clerk is about to go on maternity leave. If there's anyone who knows someone who might be interested, let me know, because I need someone to start immediately. Mm-hmm. I followed him out of the conference. We sat in the lobby for about 45 minutes and chatted. He made me the offer on the spot. I gave notice the next day, and I started on the Monday after with the clerkship. I came back to the firm thinking, okay, now got a fresh start. I took some time off, got to learn some new things. It was great. It was fun. And the firm had saved every bit of work that I had left, and they had taken, continuations and other things. And they said, we're glad you're back. You've got a stack of things you got to get to. And they're almost about to hit their deadlines. And so that's when I realized I needed to probably make a different move. And that was at the time, almost at the peak of the dot-com bubble. So this is late 1999, early 2000s. That I decided to make the move to go in-house. And I was very focused on wanting to go into a smaller company because of that feeling of wanting to be entrepreneurial and help build something.
Yeah.
And so that's how I ended up at Juniper Networks.
Huh. So what was the draw? So the draw to go in-house, I mean, you were obviously pretty successful. You were growing the law firm, you were scratching that entrepreneurial itch. What was the interest then in switching over to being more on the business side, really?
There were a couple of things. I think there were some external pressures with the dot-com bubble. Everyone was seeing, going in-house as a way to make your $1 million and go public.
Yeah.
There were a number of companies I had on my target list of the ones that I was hoping to go to, and none of them called me. And then there was this ad that I saw for Juniper Networks. I'd never heard of them. It was in a space that I thought probably couldn't be more boring, networking equipment. And I just decided, I'll use this as practice. If I'm going to interview, I should at least have tried it out with a company or two that I don't really care about.
Yeah.
Get the experience. So I submitted, and they called me. I interviewed, and I went in. I met the founder. I met the VPs of engineering and some of the different areas. And I just was fascinated. I loved it. They were taking on Cisco, this big giant at the time. They were the first company to have any success, in the marketplace against Cisco. They described to me what made them different and what their values were. And I said, I have to be here now. And if I don't get this job, I'm going to die. Mm-hmm. They shortly after they called me and made me the offer. I found out later that the general counsel hired me because she was trying to recruit another IP guy that she used to work with at her prior company. She comes over to Juniper. He doesn't want to come over. And then she saw my resume, and it turned out I had worked at the patent office just like the other IP attorneys she was trying to recruit.
I see.
We went to the same law school, and we happened to work at the same law firm. So she basically said, okay, this guy looks a lot like the guy I wanted to get, so I'm going to just hire him as a substitute. And for the first 3 months, she called me Little Kevin. That's the name of the other guy.
Great.
And I was fine. I was fine with that. But that's how I got in there, and it was just so much learning, so different, having been in private practice versus being in-house.
Yeah. Well, and how did you like it? I mean, you've obviously had a very successful career in-house, but did you find you liked it at the beginning? Because it is obviously very different.
Yeah, I would say the first couple of years, there was a lot of learning. What is it that's expected of me? What do I do? Because what I was good at and what I knew how to do in a law firm was no longer what my job was in-house. We would hire firms to do what I used to do.
Yeah.
So what is it that I do? And so there was some discovery there. I was basically one of the second lawyers to join at that time, fairly small, high growth. And there was just so many things to do. It was almost like, actually, I don't have to think too much about what should I do. It's really picking the things that should be done, and deciding what not to do. There were so many things that I just couldn't get to. So, over time, I slowly started to build a team. That was my first experience really managing. I got to understand what it meant to help build a company and an organization and be part of that. And because I was fairly early, I got to participate in things about, setting corporate values and really shaping the direction of the company, sitting in on the most senior, executive management meetings, and understanding the direction in the future, and then giving input into, why this might be a good idea or what the risks are if they were to do that. And then over time, because I'd been there for nearly 12 years, I picked up other areas as well. And so by the time I left, I had probably close to, I think, half the legal team reporting to me, and I picked up beyond IP, privacy and product, legal operations, some board of directors work. And there came a time towards the end of my tenure where I felt like, now I'm questioning whether or not this was the right thing. Am I in the right place? And the way I sort of started to think about it was, earlier on in my career, I had all of these things that I thought I wanted to do. I called it kind of my bucket list, my career bucket list. I thought, hey, if I'm in Silicon Valley, maybe it'd be cool to be a venture capitalist. Maybe it'd be cool to start a company. Maybe it'd be cool to be a judge. Maybe it'd be cool to write a book. And so I had in my mind, maybe I'm going to try to do all of these different things. After nearly 12 years, I realized I hadn't done any of those things. So I got to a point where I was like, I'm a little panicky. If I do another 12 years here, will I feel unhappy? Will I have regrets? And so I spent some time with one of the board members. It was the only attorney who was on our board, a woman named Mary Cranston, who was at Pillsbury, and she was on one of the committees that I supported. Had lunch with her, and I basically just asked for career advice. And I said, I basically described her, here's how I'm feeling. There's this bucket list of things I want to do, and I just don't think I'm going to be able to do that, and I'm feeling panicky. And she put her hand on my shoulder and said, take a deep breath. There's a term for what you're going through. It's called midlife crisis. And I felt so much better instantly. Like, yes, it's not unique to me. This is a thing. I've heard of that. I didn't really understand what it meant. It meant that, there were things that I wanted to do, and I felt like I was running out of time. It's that feeling of mortality, like this chapter, this part of my life is going to end at some point, and I haven't done any of the things that I really thought I wanted to do.
Right.
So here was the advice she gave, and I've been using this advice throughout my career as I've reached different forks in the road. She said, make that list, write down that list of the things you think you want to do, your so-called bucket list. Next to each one of those things, write down why you think you want to do that. What's your motivation? What's your purpose? Why do you care? And so make that second list for each one of those items and look at that second list. And she said, if you look at that second list, you're going to see one, maybe two things that come up over and over and over. That's the thing you actually need to go do. That's the purpose. That's the motivation that you need to fulfill. And so in engineering, parlance, that's the root cause. So that's the thing. If you do that, the things on the first list will just kind of disappear. Those are simply the symptoms of the root cause. You need to solve the root cause.
Yeah.
And so it got me thinking deeply about sort of what mattered to me and what was important to me. And, you know, if you're honest with yourself, it could be a variety of things. And it depends on what stage you are in your career. It could be, I want to make a lot of money. It could be that I want prestige. I want to be famous. I want to leave a legacy. And so you have to think really hard about what matters, what's important. And what I landed on for me was, I cared about making a difference. I cared that what I did, it mattered to the organization. I had this feeling that during the time I was at the company, if I did a good job, a great job, the best job in the history of the legal profession, it wasn't going to move the needle on the success of the company. So it felt a little bit like I was irrelevant, you know, and as long as I just didn't screw it up, you know, I couldn't also though score either. I couldn't. So it's kind of like being a goalie where I can't contribute, you know, to the score.
Yeah.
I can only mess up.
Yeah.
But there was a second layer to it, was I was also feeling like maybe the company I'm at isn't important enough in the world. It's not making a difference in society. You know, if this company disappeared, would anyone even know? So it was kind of this dual level of feeling of irrelevancy, I suppose. So then I said, so I think that's my root cause. I think I want what I do, I want to feel like it matters. So then what I did was I said, let me take that a step further. Let me try to imagine if I applied this framework, what would the perfect job be if I could imagine it? Because if I could imagine the perfect job, I could use that as the prototype. And then if I looked at other jobs, I could compare it to this perfect ideal job. And I could say, oh, it's 50% of what I thought was perfect. It's 80%, it's 90%, it's 100%. And I would have a better idea of what to look for and what not to look for. So I kind of did that mental exercise. I had decided that I wanted to go back to where I had started my career, which was IP, and find a company where IP was important and critical to the success of the company. But then also the company was important to society. As I thought about that at the time, I only came up with two companies, and it was Apple and Google. This was in 2011, 2012, there were all these patent fights going on around Android and Steve Jobs. There was the Walter Isaacson book, that biography on Steve Jobs, where he called Android a ripoff, and he was so upset, and he declared thermonuclear war against Google and Android. And so Apple was suing over Android. Microsoft was suing over Android. Oracle was suing over Android using patents and IP. Nokia and a bunch of other companies as well. And so I said, okay, it's either Apple or it's Google in the perfect world. That was kind of my vision. And then I started looking at opportunities that were you know, out there, and I said, okay, how similar is it to what I imagined? And I wasn't finding anything. And then it turned out that about 6 months after I went through this mental exercise, Google actually opened the role that I actually literally imagined. It didn't exist before. But then they decided, we're going to hire someone to oversee and bring together a bunch of our IP and patent functions and lead the strategy and the defense of Android, and head up the patent function and the IP litigation function. And I was just thrilled and ecstatic. I said, I literally imagined this 6 months earlier. It didn't exist. And now you know, not that it was really me, but it's almost like I willed it into existence. And I was like, it's amazing.
Wow.
And I found out that the way that they were considering candidates was that they were handling the search internally. This was, you know, Google didn't use external recruiters at that time. And they were reaching out to people that they either through word of mouth or through LinkedIn or through other ways discovered. There was no way to just apply for it. They didn't even post it. And so all my friends at other companies were getting calls, and I wasn't getting a call. And they would tell me, hey, I got this call from Google. I was like, whoa, I imagined that job. And they were asking for advice. What should I say? So I was sharing advice, and I was waiting for my call. Never got it. And at some point I got a little impatient, and I said, you know what, I'm not going to wait and have all my friends apply, and I'm not even getting a call. So I found an email alias for HR, and I said, I'm just going to cold send in my resume and see if I can get into the pipeline. So I send my resume. a week or two later, they contact me and they say, "We got your resume. Thank you very much. This is a very important role. We're looking for someone who's a big name, a lot of experience, someone who, quite frankly, would make headlines when we hire them. And it's not you." And this, okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the frankness, the directness, but basically, door slammed in my face.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, well, I tried. Maybe it wasn't meant to be. A couple weeks later, I said, I don't know that I want to just let someone in recruiting dictate whether or not I get my dream job or not.
Yeah.
So I looked for the general counsel's email address, and I said, I'm going to just reach out directly to the general counsel, see if I can get on his radar. So I found his email address. I sent an email, and my thought was, if I could just get 15 minutes, I think I could talk my way into the process.
Wow.
So I sent an email. A week later, I get a reply back. It's from his admin. I'm super excited. Okay, she's going to schedule me time with the general counsel. She writes back and says, got your email. I'm his admin. I manage his calendar. He's super busy. He doesn't have time for you. Leave him alone. Thank you very much. Good luck. So second door slammed in my face. I'm like, okay. I don't know what to do. They're not calling me. They're not answering my knock on the door when I knock.
Yeah.
In parallel, what was happening was I was exploring some other opportunities, and a former colleague of mine from Juniper had gone over to be the general counsel of Twitter. She introduced me to her husband, who was thinking about hiring an IP person. He had just left Google to be the general counsel at Dropbox. And so I was exploring that and comparing that role versus my ideal role. And it just didn't quite feel like it was the right fit. And he offered and said, Google's looking for this head of patents, this role. I said, yeah, I know. I tried a couple of times and got the door slammed in my face.
Yeah.
And he said, well, they've been looking for a long time and I don't think they've filled it. Would you be interested in me calling the general counsel for you and seeing if I can get you in?
Wow.
And I said, sure, why not? I've been shot twice. A third time, won't hurt me. I'm now, numb to that. So yes, I'd appreciate it. So he puts in a call. General counsel says, we've been looking to fill this role for 6 months. The CEO, Larry Page, at that time is putting a lot of pressure on the general counsel to fill it because there's all of this litigation. They just announced they were going to acquire Motorola to acquire their patents for $12.5 billion to defend this. They were getting a lot of attention at the higher levels and at the board. And the general counsel said, every time we bring in a candidate, one of the interviewers rejects the candidate. And there was kind of a general rule at the time, which was if any interviewer had veto power. And they had 12 interviewers for this role. They said every time we bring someone in, someone vetoes the candidate and we have to start over. And we brought in lots and lots of candidates. He says, yesterday, for the first time, we brought in a candidate who got through all 12. And he said, I've got the offer letter on my desk and I'm about to mail it tomorrow. So, he said to the Dropbox general counsel, I think we're done. I've filled it and we finally found someone. Yeah. And to the credit to the Dropbox general counsel, and I would not have been able to think this quickly on my feet. So, I appreciate, I owe this part of my career to him and his quick thinking. He said, if you've waited 6 months, what's one more day? Why don't you just talk to him? Wait one more day to send out that letter and just talk to this guy. Maybe you'll like him better. So the Google general counsel says, yeah, okay, good idea. I'll do that. So they call me, they set up some time. I talk to him and he says, okay, I like you enough that I'm going to put you through the interview. The 12. But we're going to have to do it fast. So you're going to have to meet everyone in one day, back to back. So we went from 9 a.m. to 5 or 6 p.m. straight. And I basically came in a couple days later, met everyone. And he said, come in, do that, and we'll let you know the next day. So I did that. I met all these people. The next day they called me and they said, we're going with you. Wow. So I went from, I couldn't get in the door, I couldn't get him to even answer, to within a week, I was able to get the offer. So for me, that was just, it almost felt like it was meant to be, because I had literally imagined a year now earlier, this role being the ideal role that I wanted. And quite frankly, I had a lot of time to think about what would I do in that role? How would I, do it differently than it's being done? So by the time I got to the interviews, I had all the answers in my head for what I would do.
All right.
And I think they liked that enough to give me the offer.
It's such a great story, Alan. I love the persistence of it. I love the fact that you rejected numerous times and you didn't let that dissuade you. I mean, those are so important things because, every one of us, no matter how successful we are, we're always afraid of being rejected. And there's nothing worse than that feeling. It leaves you feeling like, oh, nobody wants me, and it's just a horrible thing to deal with. But I love the way you kept trying and you didn't let that, hold you back. I mean, it's a great story. I'm sure you've told that numerous times to younger lawyers.
Yeah, it is one that I tell. I mean, and there's a longer version with even more details, but certainly persistence is one of the big, I think, lessons learned.
Yeah.
A couple smaller lessons too. One is don't settle. Like there were opportunities where I could have taken other roles that were not the ones that I would have been happy with and satisfied with.
Yeah.
They would have been relatively better than where I currently was,
Yeah.
but I didn't take them because I said, I know what I want and this isn't it.
Yeah, right.
So having that clarity was helpful. And then there's another small lesson here around what you would call weak ties. And so there's this thing around strong ties versus weak ties. Strong ties is the network that you're closest with, the people that you spend the most time with.
Yeah.
It turns out strong ties are least helpful when it comes to networking and opening doors and creating opportunities. It's the weak ties that are more valuable. And so because my former colleague introduced me to her husband, who I had never met, and through a short period, he's the one who made the call to the general counsel at Google. It was that weak tie that actually got me in the door. My close network wasn't helpful for me. It was the more distant network, and I was willing to actually even entertain having lunch with the Dropbox general counsel. I had to drive an hour from my house. I was like, I don't know if I want to do that. It's a hassle. I don't know this guy. I probably wouldn't go there anyways. But I let myself be open to, well, let me meet him. He sounds like an interesting person. You never know what doors that might open. But there's been a lot of research on the value of weak ties versus strong ties. And I would encourage, many, people to really build that part of your network, because that is going to open doors to things that you normally wouldn't be have visibility into.
Is there some reason why the strong ties are not as effective as the weak ties? I mean, is there some reason for that, or it seems counterintuitive?
It's very counterintuitive. The reason is that while those are the people you know the best and are most likely to help you, what they know are the same things you know. And so your circle of close friends, close colleagues, they see the same opportunities that you see. And so there's nothing new. So you're not able to expose yourself to new areas because it's too close to what you already do.
I see.
The further out you go, you may open yourself up to new professions, new industries, new types of roles, small companies, big companies, things are completely off your radar. And then that, if you make a good enough relationship, that might open a door to something that you otherwise would not have even known about.
Yeah, that's super great advice. Was the Google job everything you expected? I mean, it sounds like you had high expectations for it.
The thing that when I reflect back, my years at Juniper really set me up to learn. I mean, I learned a heck of a lot. I made a lot of mistakes. I learned a lot. I learned about myself. I learned about leadership. I learned about, many, many things. And I felt like going to Google was kind of like moving from practice to performance. Kind of like, okay, now here's the big stage. You said you wanted this, here you go. On my first day after orientation, the general counsel comes over to my desk and says, hey, hope you're settling in. I forgot to tell you, but I set up a meeting for you to meet with your entire team in the cafeteria in about an hour. So, you're going to go, I set it up so you could just introduce yourself, talk about your background, any thoughts you have about what you plan to do, and for the team. And it was about 100 people. And, the largest team I had managed up to that point is about 15 people. So it was, considerably bigger than I'd ever managed before. And I had almost zero time to prepare, very little time. And so it was things like that where it was constantly one thing after another, where it's like, you're on the big stage, there's less wiggle room to make mistakes. And so when you have the chance to develop and to practice in safe places where it's like, okay, it's a smaller group, develop your public speaking skills, develop thinking on your feet, develop strategic thinking. do it while you can, because once you're thrust into a spotlight, once you're thrust into a bigger stage, you've got to perform.
Right.
Within a month, I had a number of meetings with Larry Page, and one of the big lessons you think you know everything, and then you go into new situations, you realize you know nothing. We had this situation that required me to get in front of Larry and basically get his direction and what he wanted to do. We were about to close the Motorola acquisition. Google belonged to an organization that required us to license our patents, certain patents, into a pool. And Motorola had deliberately stayed out of that organization because they didn't want to license their patents. Mm-hmm. We were acquiring Motorola to get their patents. And so if we closed the deal, Motorola patents would also be licensed, mm-hmm. which would have devalued the portfolio and undermined the purpose of the acquisition. If we pulled out of the organization before the close, it would have looked really bad from a public relations standpoint that we were now, pulling out of this organization that we were very supportive of. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of, do we pull out or do we stay in? Do we pull out or do we stay in? And so basically teed this question up for Larry to say, we've got two choices. Here's our recommendation. We want to make sure you're okay with this because it obviously affects the considerable value that we've paid for the company. And he thought about it and he said, I don't like either of those options. Give me a third option. So we went back and, we thought about it and said, is there a way we could structure this legally that would keep patents out, blah, blah, blah. We looked at it up and down, talked to outside counsel, came back and said, our conclusion was there really isn't a third option that will work. Mm-hmm. Back to Larry and said, there is no third option. There's only the two options. And he looks at me and says, I don't like these options. I want a third option. And I was insistent at that time. And I'm thinking, look, I know what I'm doing. He doesn't know law, so I'm gonna have to teach him. and I was like, Larry, let me explain this to you again. There is no third option. There's either this or there's this. That's it. He pauses and says, if I gave you $100 million, could you go to the organization, negotiate a new set of terms just for us that will allow us to preserve the Motorola patents and keep them out of the pool without us having to withdraw? And I thought about it, I said, well, sure, if I had that much money, I could go to the organization. I'm sure would be willing to negotiate because this would more than offset whatever lost revenue that they would get by having those patents out. Yeah. Well, yeah, of course. And in that case, and there was a long pause, and he looks at me and he says, so there was a third option. And it just taught me this lesson, like, sometimes many of us think with constraints, right? We think about what's practical. We think, I was thinking like, well, of course I don't have infinite resources. Right. But Larry's basically saying to me, what if you did? Mm-hmm. Could you do then? And then he said, well, so now if I gave you $20 million instead of $100 million, do you think you could do it? I said, no, I don't know, maybe. Not 100% sure, but there's a possibility. And he said, what if I gave you 10 million? So all of a sudden it became from ridiculous, but yeah, there's a third option, to maybe it is possible. And I was so adamant before that there was no other third option. So I would say throughout the time I was at Google, to answer your question, yeah, it was everything I expected and more, because I learned so much more being on the bigger stage, interfacing with people who were not limited by the normal constraints that many of us are limited by. Especially lawyers. Lawyers tend to come at it from a risk lens. Yeah, for sure. We're very limited. But to be able to have these new perspectives really opened my eyes.
Yeah. That's a really interesting story, Alan. I really like it. I recently interviewed a guy named Jonah Berger who talked about this interesting thing when you're often faced with the dilemma of should you do this or should you do that? What you should be asking is, what can you do? Like, in other words, don't limit yourself to what, whether you should do this, because that was kind of the maybe thing. Well, should we do option A or should we do option B? In other words, ask the question, what can you do? And then that somehow opens up your thinking a little bit. And that kind of goes to the story you just told, actually.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's another person you interviewed recently, Annie Duke. And in her first book that she wrote, Thinking in Bets, she has this concept of good decisions versus good outcomes. And, many of the things that we do, we have imperfect information. Yeah. So you do the best you can with the information you have to try to make decisions. But the question is that do you focus on, okay, based on what I know, I think there's an 80% chance of getting this right. If we do this, it'll be okay. But then what that means is that 20% of the time, it might turn out to be bad.
Yeah.
And so what happens too often is that people focus on the bad outcome. And so they look after the fact and they say, it didn't work out. I made the wrong decision. And so going forward, I'm going to learn from this. The lesson I'm going to learn is not to have done that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually think of it in terms of, but there was an 80% chance that it would have had a good outcome.
Right.
You should make that same decision every time.
Yeah.
It just so happened that in this one instance, you fell into the 20%. So that's another thing that also has stuck with me. And one of the things that I've tried to do is that every time I've learned something is how do I internalize it? How do I put it to practice? How do I make it something that now is just something I don't even have to think about, but I'm able to apply? Like what you described in terms of that unconstrained thinking, what can you do? It's one of the things that I've tried to learn and make almost automatic, and then shift to now what is feasible, what's practical, what is actually possible. This is also part of, for example, design thinking. When you think of kind of the first phase of design thinking, it's much more open aperture, open lens in terms of brainstorming and thinking about all possibilities before you start to shut down and discard some. There's an interesting flip to this, which is constraint-based thinking, which is if you put some constraints, how would you do it? So if I only gave you a limited budget, how would you do this? Sometimes, and one of the things in my time at Meta that I've seen is that in the good times when budgets are plentiful and, we can just hire, we hired a lot of people in a very short amount of time because it was an easy solution. But when you get to a place where, okay, if we now couldn't hire, what would we do? That forces you to be innovative and creative and to think more efficiently and effectively, and avoid a lot of waste. And sometimes when you're unconstrained, you can also lead to wasteful thinking, wasteful solutions. And so I think both constrained and unconstrained are useful models to think about and being very deliberate about how you make decisions and how you think.
Well, that's a perfect segue to ask me. So you're at Google, it was your dream job. You thought about it a long time. You have this incredible story about how you got there. Why'd you go to Facebook?
So what happened is that all the reasons I came to Google were able to resolve. And so they had gone away. All those litigations, I was involved in negotiations and settlements, and so Microsoft and Apple and much of the Oracle case, Nokia, they were all just being resolved. And so then it was just a matter of, okay, I could stay, and it was just a matter of now steady state, maintenance, incremental improvement. Or I could go someplace where I felt like there was a bigger challenge. And that's one of the things that I've learned about myself is that I need a big challenge. That's what helps keep me engaged. It's what helps keep me occupied. It's what keeps me interested. At the time, Facebook was, this is in 2017, was experiencing a lot of issues and challenges. And there were some new aspects of IP, with Facebook. IP isn't just about the products and services they offer, but it's also about the content that is, the user-generated content that's uploaded onto the platform that is also part of the responsibility of the company. So there were aspects of IP, but then also just the company was in a different place than where Google was at the time I left. And then within a few months, Cambridge Analytica hit, and basically everything changed. It was kind of like, in some ways, a big bang. And all of a sudden, there was all of this scrutiny, lots of investigations, new regulations that were being proposed that would regulate and govern companies like Facebook. And so during the time I was there, I was able to pick up some additional responsibility and manage not just the IP team, but all of the product legal teams, what we call Reality Labs Legal, which is basically our hardware side of our business, as well as legal operations. And so it was an opportunity to try lots of different things and be involved in some things that are very core to the business.
So has it been a very different experience than your time at Google in many ways?
In many ways different. I think externally the companies look very similar. Internally, they are similar, but the difference, because of their similarities, the differences make them are even more stark. It's kind of like siblings. They look generally similar, but once you get to know them, you see how different they can really be. And on the inside, I would say one of the big differences, and someone else who had gone over from Google to Facebook in the early days told me this before I came over. I basically said, what's the difference between them? They look very similar. And he basically said, Google is more data focused. And if you think about the founders, you think about the nature of the product, millions and billions of bits of data that go into developing a search result.
Mm-hmm.
It is processing so much data, so data intensive. It's very data focused. You could have two engineers sitting side by side in cubicles. They will never talk to each other. They will communicate through, the systems that they are both working on. Facebook, very different. You look at the nature of the product. It's a social network. It's about relationships. Right. You look at the executives; they're more relational in nature, and so the whole culture of Facebook was very different. Relationships were critical for success at Facebook, less so at Google, and so things like that were just became more clear that it's a different environment, and success in this company would require different skills, different attributes. Just because of the nature of the values and the culture compared to Google.
Very interesting. So, Alan, let me ask you, I'd love your perspective on this because, since you were in private practice and obviously been very successful, really in both, but obviously very successful in-house. And I interviewed a ton of lawyers, young and old, and in various levels of their career. What would you say? I mean, do you think the skill set to be successful in-house is very different from being in private practice, or are they the same? I mean, obviously you're both acting as lawyers in both cases. Tell me a little bit about what's your sense about that now that you've experienced both.
You could describe it as skill set. I think it's slightly. I look at it slightly differently. The roles that lawyers play in a law firm are different than the roles you play in-house. So when you're in-house, a lot of what you're trying to do is help achieve business goals while reducing risk. When you're at a law firm, you're basically being engaged to be an expert in a particular area and to really identify what all the risks are and to try to reduce them to as close to zero as possible. And so the goals are a little bit different. When lawyers go from law firms to in-house, oftentimes they have the mindset of trying to bring risk down to zero. And many times what I think those lawyers who made that transition, that's where they fail, is when they're not able to strike the balance. And in some ways, you might say that the kind of the thinking of, if some is good, then more is better. Mm-hmm. That's not always true. And so more risk mitigation could also be, inconsistent with achieving the business goal. Mm-hmm. So if you think about to the extreme, if you wanted to reduce legal risk in a company, the absurd conclusion could be shut down the business.
Right.
And so what you don't want to do is cure the disease but kill the patient. And so it's really about how do you strike the balance. And I think where sometimes lawyers are challenged is getting comfortable with taking some risk and balancing that and saying, like, look, there's upside for us taking this risk. How are you able to strike that balance and advise, and communicate clearly to your business stakeholders, what those risks might look like, how they can then translate that into what the potential upside is from a business perspective, and then how you might deal with it after the fact. We don't have to prevent all risk, but when they come up, are we able to deal with it after the fact and then deal with it then? That oftentimes is the better solution than trying to prevent all of it, in the first instance.
So is your conclusion that your mindset is better suited for the in-house than trying to just be the legal expert? Is that what you've kind of concluded after your 20, 30 years of being a lawyer?
I found that it's much more, I'm much more engaged, I think, being in-house and having that hand and involvement in strategy, in helping the business achieve goals, helping the business set goals, is part of the role I think that good in-house counsel can play. And so when you think of yourself not just as a lawyer, but as a business person with legal skills and legal experience and legal background, for me, that is what excites me. And so this then full circle goes back to, did I make a mistake and wish I'd gone to business school instead of law school? It's not so much which education you have, so much is the role that you're going to end up playing and what it is you're doing. And I feel like being in-house, I'm able to get both. And to me, that's very exciting, very energizing, very fulfilling.
I love the story how you talked about, those two important mentors in your life. That mentor that was at Bell Labs that kind of got you on the patent career, and then you talked about the board member at Juniper. How much mentoring do you do now for younger lawyers? Is that something you really also try to pass them, to do?
I try to. I mean, this is something that I actually invest quite a bit of my time for people within the company that at Meta now, people I've worked with in the past, people I meet in conferences. I go to different organizations, especially with younger lawyers,
Yeah.
and try to share and try to remember what it was like for me at that time.
Yeah.
One of the big things that I end up talking about with many people that are early career is this concept of explore versus exploit. And depending on what stage you are in your career, if you're early stage, that's the time to try new things. That's the time to explore. Try this practice area, try that practice area, try a big firm, try a small firm, try in-house, try private practice, because you don't know what you don't know yet. And you're going to find some things you don't like, but at the same time, you're going to find and appreciate the things that you do like. And then over time, you'll get then to the point mid and later career where you can really exploit the things that you are most interested in and the strengths and the skills that you bring, and match that with the needs of whatever area it is you want to pursue. And so it's interesting, there's a lot of science around this as well, the explore versus exploit. And it actually is a methodology that's used in when they solve the one-armed bandit problem, which was the problem that apparently couldn't be solved for many, many years until they applied this approach, which is the question of, if you're in a casino and are you better off sticking at one slot machine and sticking in your quarters and getting your payout, or are you better off just walking around and trying different slot machines? And so they tried to solve that mathematically, and they finally came up with an answer, and the answer depended on how much time you had. The more time you have, the better off you are moving around and trying different machines. The less time you have, the better you are just sticking with one. And so if you think about that same approach, the more time you have left in your career, the better off you're trying new things. And then the less time you have, the better off you are really focusing on the things that you are good at and that you're most interested in.
So tell me, what is left on Alan Lowe's bucket list now? I mean, you've obviously accomplished a lot. What's on your bucket list remaining?
One of the things that I've always had in the back of my mind, and I haven't decided how much, I've satisfied this or not, is really moving more into the business. And whether that's completely out of legal or whether that's in a role that is more business oriented than legal, I'm not sure. But when you're in a law firm, one of the things that private practice lawyers love to say is that that's a business decision.
Yeah.
Here's the legal analysis,
yeah.
but it's up to the business to decide what to do.
Yeah.
Sometimes those business decisions are actually made by the in-house lawyers.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're made by executives and non-lawyers. But I really feel like there's more that I probably have to offer to help drive, a company's success more on the business strategy side of things. And so, there could be a way to find, develop a role that has more of that within legal. And it could be that I look to see whether or not, and sometime in the future, there's a role outside of legal where I can do that. Earlier in my career, before I left Juniper, I had the opportunity to leave legal and to head up corporate development. Our head of corporate development had left. I used to do a lot of work with them. They said, "Hey, would you like to move out of legal and do that?" It was at the same time that they offered me to take over the corporate securities function within legal. And that's when I did this analysis, and I said, the perfect role in my head is actually this role at Google that doesn't exist right now, but it's not either of these things. And so at that time, I kind of set those aside and said, that's not what I want to do. I want to go do this thing. And then it happened. I'm now kind of coming around and saying, now is now the time to try to do more of those kinds of things that earlier in my career, I wasn't interested in, but do I want to feel like I want to round it out and do that? So that, part of, I think, for any of us, we don't want to look back and have regrets and feel like I didn't get to do something, I didn't try something, and I held myself back, and I wish I had the courage to have at least done it, even if I had failed. And I don't think any of us want to be in that position. I certainly don't. And so what I'd love to do is just have experience and try things. And it's less about, I'm going to look good, I'm going to make a lot of money. It's like there's a lot of trappings that are easy to fall into. I just want to have a career I can look back on and feel like I tried lots of things, and I have lots of experiences that all of which I will treasure, regardless of what the outcomes were. They were all good and have become part of me.
Do you credit your dad for leading you to law school then? Did you give your dad credit for that?
I do, and certainly credit for leading me into engineering. And if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't have done it any differently. At the time, though, I wasn't smart enough to realize that this was the right thing. But now I am so grateful that that's the path I took.
Yeah. Well, Alan, it's been a really interesting conversation with you, and I really appreciate your taking the time. If you do decide to do something else and try that business or whatever else, please come back and tell me about it.
I will do. Great talking to you, Richard.
This is Richard Hsu and Alan Lowe. Thanks.